Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Golden, and I am ArtsFund's Program Advocacy and Operations Manager. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Optimizing the Board Chair CEO Relationship with Rena Henderson Mason of Bold Agenda. Before I hand things over to Rena, I have a few quick items to run through with y'all. First, this is the second in a series of 3 webinars we are hosting with Rena centered on building stronger boards. The first webinar in the series, Broken Engagement, Why Has Our Board Checked Out? How Do We Fix It? Was on April 11th, and a recording is available on our website. The third and final session is titled Breaking Down Barriers to Achieving Real Board Diversity and Inclusion, and is on June 7th. You can read more about these and register on our site at artsfund.org/events. These webinars are part of ArtsFund's annual convening programming sponsored by the Boeing Company. Our convening series provides the cultural sector a platform for sharing of resources, best practices, and perspectives to expand our collective capacity to serve our community. We partner with local, regional, and national practitioners and thought leaders like Rena and Bold Agenda to foster discussion and provide tools and training opportunities in direct response to the needs identified by regional arts and cultural organizations like all of you. Whether this is your first time joining us or if you're a returning attendee, thank you for being part of our convenings. Now for a few housekeeping notes. First, this webinar is in listen-only mode for attendees, meaning you're all on mute, so all questions and any comments should be typed into the question field in your control panel. We will take time for questions around the middle of the presentation and again at the end. As a reminder, this webinar is scheduled to last an hour and 15 minutes, so we're planning to wrap up around 12:15. Please be aware that this session is being recorded, and we will be sharing a link for those who are unable to attend. I will also share this with all of you after we have it uploaded and ready to view later this week. Please feel free to share this with any board or staff from your organization. Next, you will receive a survey in follow-up to this webinar, and we ask you to please take a few minutes to fill it out as we value your feedback. We developed this webinar series from input we have received from past events and conversations to best suit the needs of our cultural partners, and your response will help set the course for future offerings like this. And now, before we get things started, I'll give a brief introduction to Rena. Rena Henderson Mason is a trusted advisor to mission-driven board and staff leaders, helping them shape their boards for high performance and tell their unique stories. She trains and coaches boards and leaders on high-performance teams, governance, fundraising, recruitment and retention, diversity and inclusion, and succession planning. Her specialty is empowering board and staff leaders to embrace change, push bold ideas, and build great teams. She has coached board chairs and executive directors and CEOs through a range of organizational challenges, including growth, leadership transitions, strategic alliances, restructuring, turnaround, and crisis. In addition to her work at Bold Agenda, Rena also serves on the Board Development Committee for the Arts Alliance of Illinois and the Chicago chapter of the National Association of Women Business Owners. We are lucky and grateful to have Rena and her expertise for these sessions. And with that, I'll hand it over to her.
Good morning. I hope everybody is doing well today. I'm happy to be here discussing the most critical relationships at a nonprofit, the board chair, CEO, or executive director relationship. So today on our objective on this webinar is really to understand why this relationship is so important and the engine behind successful organizations. What are the factors that cause this relationship to fall apart, but also what are the elements that help make it work in any life cycle? Then we'll walk through the essential elements that give the relationship a strong foundation. Understand the elements that help take it to the next level, optimize it, and make it a high-performing relationship. And then provide a way for you to think about an action plan that can work for your board chair CEO relationship that is mission-driven and sustainable. What this webinar will not do, it will not solve your board chair CEO problems. That takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. This is really for you to begin to see the relationship and begin to diagnose. I'm giving you some tools for diagnosis of where to start, where to begin to strengthen it or to re-energize it, or maybe it's getting started. So a 1-hour webinar will not solve any of your board chair CEO relationship issues. And it is such a unique relationship that even in one organization, The board chair CEO relationship can change when the board chair changes and or when the CEO changes. So I just want to share a little bit about why I chose this topic, because I work with boards at a variety of levels. Some of it is facilitation and meetings. Sometimes it's consulting, doing core board governance work. Sometimes it's coaching. I do a lot of strategic planning, which is working with the board and senior staff. And as I was working with boards and organizations of varying sizes in different life cycles and a range of sectors, there was one unifying theme. You could tell the health of an organization by the health of the board chair CEO relationship. Most of this was just from observing, but some of it was really digging down and hearing conversations. So if the organization was successful in executing and on an upswing, the board chair CEO relationship was strong and healthy. If the organization suffered in many areas and was usually failing, the board chair CEO relationship was dysfunctional. When an organization is in crisis, one of its top problems will likely be a poorly functioning board chair CEO relationship. Now, you can get that relationship together and still it may not mean that you'll have a wildly successful organization. But it does mean if that relationship is right, all of the other organization's challenges are easier to conquer, and it increases the probability that you will be wildly successful. So if I'm coming into an organization, and I do have a client like that, and actually an arts and culture client like that, that I really zoom in and help them focus on their communication style and getting to work together, recognizing that the rest of the board, the rest of the organization is dependent on it. So let's keep moving. Tell me a little bit about yourself. So whether you're a nonprofit CEO, a board chair, soon to be board chair, senior staff, or board member. So it looks like we have a combination of, okay, board chair, soon to be board chair. So that's good. And other board members, but also nonprofit CEOs. So that's great. I'll try to answer, give the perspective on both sides. So let's keep moving. Another audience poll on your relationship. How would you characterize the organization's board chair CEO relationship? Highly effective, good but could be stronger, showing signs of stress, highly dysfunctional, or in transition, where there is either a new board chair and or CEO. Okay, it looks like good but could be stronger is at the highest, but a lot of you are in transition. So there's a little bit of dysfunction there or showing signs of stress, and we'll talk a little bit about that. This is great, and particularly for those who are in transition. Getting it off to a good start is like actually half the battle if you start on a good foot, just like any relationship. So I do want to back up a little bit and explain that arts organizations many times have a little bit more complicated uh, board chair CEO relationship because sometimes there's an artistic leader that also reports to the board. And in those cases where there's an artistic leader and say a managing director or executive director that both report to the board, those two staff leaders really need to function like an office of the CEO. They need to be on the same page when they communicate to the board. I've seen sometimes, even though the artistic leader may report to the board, they may leave most of the communications with the board to the ED, and or sometimes it's shared. But whatever the case may be, whatever structure you have, your voice should be singular. The message coming out of the artistic leader and the executive director should be one. You should resolve all of your differences before you get to the board. In fact, if there is ongoing conflict that you can't resolve, it may be that you present, it's sort of risky though, present sort of all sides of the issue and bring the board chair in to come to some resolution. But I would caution you on making this a relationship triangle. There is no relationship triangle that works well. Let's talk a little bit about why this relationship is so important. It's the engine that drives the momentum in the organization. It has an impact on staff and volunteers. If it's not working well, they may feel pulled in a variety of directions and hesitant to raise critical issues. Their overall morale and performance may be affected. The influence on the board, when it is not working, other board members may feel ineffective or become disengaged because they don't want to deal with a power struggle. Good board members leave when there is too much conflict. Great board members rise to the occasion when they have strong leadership in their board chair and CEO. And then external stakeholders, such as funders, external partners, community leaders, really gain confidence from believing that the board chair and CEO are a strong partnership. They must see a united front, otherwise they'll withhold or limit their support until they feel comfortable that the team can do the right thing. I see this happening with my client that has a strained CEO and board chair relationship. Other board members are watching. They're holding back their financial support until they see some confidence given by the board chair and the CEO. So getting this right is really important. Culture. Everyone's watching these two in the organization. Their behavior, their decisions help set the tone and culture of the organization. They provide the foundation for the board and staff to become really a high-performing team. And then the mission, which should come first. A healthy relationship is necessary really to be mission-focused and avoid energy directed to other areas. So why does it fall apart so often? And we'll look at really there's two big areas that the structure and the processes many times are broken, and then sometimes the behavior and the communication are broken. So when we look at the structure, I mean, this is really supposed to be a partnership, but sometimes the board chair and the CEO come into it thinking that the board chair is the boss and the CEO is reports to the boss. I think that is where it fails. The board chair and the CEO need to see each other as partners in support of the mission. The board chair really driving the agenda for the board, the CEO driving the agenda for the staff. And if you have that boss employee mindset, that natural tension creates a lot of conflict. There's also the tension there between one being volunteer and one being paid. And frequently people who become board chairs, and certainly people who are CEOs, are type A driven leaders who are used to being at the top of the food chain, and now they're having to have a relationship that is really dependent. It's interdependent, and as opposed to being in a more authoritative role. Many times board chairs and CEOs come into roles where their predecessor didn't really set a good track record for a healthy board chair CEO relationship. Most people are not offered training on managing this relationship either. Poor habits and patterns may have been established by their predecessors. The other problem is when there's been a lack of a succession plan. This means that the person who assumes the role of board chair is not necessarily the most qualified, but the one who finds the role the least objectionable. So if they have to be coaxed into this role instead of groomed, where they are developed over time to step up, there's always a certain amount of tension. The board chair may be not as engaged as they should be. And then, of course, most board chairs only hold this role every, 2 to 3 years. Most chairs change within that time. So it can be challenging to build up trust and a strong working style in this short period, particularly since they are not working together on a daily basis. And I think that's the other challenge. Poor training. Just because you've been selected as leader doesn't mean that you understand what it takes to be a highly effective board chair or CEO. Most organizations don't provide the training or coaching that board chairs or CEOs need to lead effectively. Most funders view this as an expense instead of an investment that accrues as an asset to the organization. In reality, I recommend that funders, when you're talking to your funders, and clearly ArtsFund has been investing in this board training and leadership development, but for the rest of your funders, you really should make the case that this is insurance for the effectiveness of their other grant money. So looking at behavior and communication and how that may lead to challenges. So I do think many times the board chair is coming from a corporate environment where it tends to be more authoritative, a more authoritative style and culture than the nonprofit that they are chairing. Most arts organizations tend to have a more collaborative culture, and sometimes when they come in with that corporate style, it doesn't fly well on the board nor with the CEO. So it's about adapting styles so that you match or complement the CEO and the organization, but understanding that those styles may need to adjust depending on the issues that you're dealing with. I think the number one area that is always a challenge is really misunderstanding the roles. Who does what is not always clear, especially in small to medium-sized organizations. There is an overlap of duties, but there's this potential for micromanagement, and we'll get into that later. And then potentially being disconnected, either because of time, process, personality, or culture. The board chair and CEO walk into the relationship without strong connections. And they many times are dealing with issues and don't have the time to develop that relationship. I highly recommend that these two take the time to invest in connecting and building just a personal relationship. So some of the warning signs that that the engine is not being maintained or tended to on a regular basis. These first three really are about power and control. So that, sometimes there are unilateral decisions being made when major decision making is done without consultation with the other party. Underneath that is that there is a lack of trust or comfort that the other party will provide valuable advice. So implicit in that is that they're unwilling to share the power. The weak discussion of the issues, they perceive the other side as not having the knowledge or power to participate fully and add value, or lack of disclosure, where the CEO or board chair conceal information to the other. This is really about power and trust issues. The next area in terms of warning signs has to do with communication and accountability. So action without feedback, that's the CEO performs his or her duties without the benefit of feedback from the board, either because there's not a formal evaluation process or the CEO has not asked for the feedback or the board chair has not felt compelled or committed enough to offer it. They should have a relationship such that they are giving and receiving feedback on just about everything, good and bad. And if there's only interaction at meetings, then something is terribly wrong. Board chairs and CEOs need to be talking at least every other week or as frequently as weekly in order to build the trust and mutual respect that needs to be there for effective problem solving. Some of this is about not airing the dirty laundry at meetings, really heading off problems before they happen so that when you get into meetings, you can be focused on the agenda, getting through it, and really solving issues that the entire board, or in the case of a committee, need to solve. This demoralized or disengaged board. The last webinar was about disengagement, and this is key. If the board chair or CEO are not firing on all pistons, it's many times it's because they see poor leadership coming from the board chair CEO, or the pair have not done their job in keeping members engaged, holding board members accountable. And so a lot of that really revolves around the board chair's role, managing the board, but to the extent that the CEO can help support that effort, they need to be partners. I really encourage everyone to take a new mindset, a fresh mindset about really getting this relationship to work. One CEO that I've worked with believed that her board was a gift and that she just had to unwrap it to receive all the treasures from that gift. But it was really the board chair who needed to help her unwrap the gift. She could not do it by herself. And so I want you to think about moving from a mindset that a board is an organizational structure that has to be tolerated to one that bears gifts. I mean, boards are a time-tested governance structure. And I would say the old mindset would say that it's a structure that is dictated by state corporation laws and IRS compliance. I would say the new mindset is that it's a structure that allows the CEO to expand his or her leadership capabilities. If you begin to think about your board, if you're an ED or CEO, as an extension of your leadership capability, you'll have a different mindset about, one, who should be on the board and how to leverage their abilities, but also walking into the relationship with the board chair and helping them tap all those capabilities. So the board chair's role really should be helping to activate leaders. Use your board chair to make sure that committee chairs are active and being held accountable for a plan for the committee. Ideally, this would be a joint effort with the board chair and CEO and each committee chair, meeting to help them set the direction for their committee's efforts, given the board's broader goals and the strategic plan. This is where you need to let the leaders lead. Offline conversations. This is where the work of the board is moved forward. It is where relationships are built and strengthened. This is where problems are solved. And to the extent that the board chair is engaged, they should be having a lot of offline conversations with the CEO, but also with committee chairs and individual board members. Elevating strengths. When you understand what your board chair or CEO is really good at, then you can let them loose and help them do what they do best. Figure out how to best support them. This is where the engines are fueled. So I'll give you an example. There was one board chair that I know who had great relationships, deep network, but did not like fundraising. The CEO came to him and said, "You open the doors, get the meeting, I will do the selling and close." Together, they raised nearly $500,000 by being a great tag team. So if you see yourself as partners, it can be powerful. But you should also, share and target your weaknesses. You must understand what you need help with or the skills that you have not developed fully. That goes on both sides for the board chair and the CEO. You should share these weaknesses so that the other party can help you shore them up. Another example is executive director, fairly new executive director, started the relationship with the board chair and recognized that one of his weaknesses was he was just not financially savvy, and revealed this to the board chair. The board chair had the ED meet with his company's CFO to review the organization's audit and monthly financials. In that respect, he provided him with a template that helped him think about the critical questions to ask about the financials, at least from an ED perspective. He wasn't asking him to be the financial person in the organization, but sometimes your board chair has access to resources that can be helpful. Similarly, I think most board chairs should walk into that position with a little humility, recognizing that they have a lot to learn too, and understanding sort of what they need to know in order to be effective. So, understanding the roles. This is where the relationship goes wrong most of the time. This chart is helpful. Actually, Board Source has a wonderful, like, one-pager on the, if any of you are members, on the board chair CEO relationship. And at the end of this webinar, I have actually a list of resources of books that are relevant to this issue that can help you with this. The big thing is that the board chair leads and manages the board. The CEO leads and manages the staff. And if your board chair is talking to your staff without your consent as a CEO, there's a problem. Staff should be talking to board members, but only as it relates to supporting committees and board work. And the CEO needs to understand who's talking to whom about what. When there's a clear understanding how the work will be divided so that each person is not stepping on the other toes, then that forms an effective relationship. There may be some overlap on larger issues such as fundraising, capital projects, and governance. So when the board chair many times is too often focused on procedures and making sure everyone gets their report in, rather than making sure that the right problems or discussions are on the agenda. The CEO too often want approval from their board, so they talk at them instead of building healthy debate where they talk with them. So there are some shared roles and responsibilities. Focusing on the mission, constantly asking the board or questioning the board on the board chair side and the CEO on the staff side, making sure that everybody is focused on the mission. And strategic planning. When strategic planning is underway, that is a board staff effort. To what extent who drives it may depend on the size of the organization and the capacity of the staff. But it should be shared in terms of setting the larger strategic priorities. Frequently, it's an iterative process where it may start with the staff and move to the board and then go back to the staff. But many times in the organizations I'm involved with, it is a very much a shared activity. Setting board priorities, the board chair and CEO should be talking regularly, and in their regular conversations is like, what are we teeing up for the next board meeting? What needs to be going through the committees to make sure that we hit some of these agenda items like the budget, the audit, some things that you know that there's a specified process. Any new initiatives? How do we make that happen in between meetings so that we can get it on the agenda? Resource development. They should be talking all the time about fundraising. Now, the focus of the board chair is really helping the CEO think about strategy, whereas the CEO is really thinking about strategy and execution. And to the extent the board chair should really be engaging the board to support the fundraising efforts. Advocacy. So the board and the CEO need to be involved in advocating for your mission. And that can mean in your community, it can mean among politicians, it can mean really among key decision makers, whether it's funders, whether it's policymakers, um, or constituents who come to your events. So the real challenge is in sharing and how do you maintain the balance. But that comes really about having a strong relationship, talking about things, detailing expectations, um, and then really assessing the board's performance collectively and individually. The expectation should be that the board chair needs to govern more and manage less, and the CEO needs to manage more and govern less. There's a little bit of overlap, but if they stay in their lanes, they will be fairly powerful and have a strong relationship. So I'd like to take some questions now, a few questions to.
Hi, Rena. We don't have any yet, so I just want to remind our attendees that if you have any questions, to type them in the question field in your control panel and send them in, and then I will ask them to Rena.
Okay. I'll just wait a few seconds just to see if anyone has any. Otherwise, I'll keep moving. Questions? There will be time at the end to answer questions. I always like to pause in the middle just so that they don't collect. No questions? Okay, we'll keep moving. So some of the essential elements of a great board chair CEO relationship is trust. And there's 4 areas of trust, 4 levels really. The situational, that people have trust that you will deliver in certain situations, that there's seamless communication, so that you've begun to internalize each other's preferences for communicating. And that really comes from mutual respect, a strong communication habit, and a comfort with being a little bit vulnerable. I think that's important. And then you need to be confident in each other's personalities and competencies. There's understanding those strengths and weaknesses and what they're good at, and trusting that they will fulfill what they've promised. And then character, that there's this trust that each will deliver and put the mission first and then leave personal agendas to the side. So we talked about the other essential elements, the clear roles and responsibilities. I mean, really, nothing adds more stress than someone entering your lane and doing what you thought you were supposed to be doing. Effective communication. I think it's really important to communicate openly about difficult issues as well as the more mundane. Your counterpart can't really know what support you need unless you convey where you're struggling. And then leading with integrity. That's honesty, ethics, and mission-driven actions are at the core of this relationship. Some of the optimal elements that you want to achieve in this relationship is this understanding of the shared responsibility. We talked a little bit about that. Um, it's a constructive partnership where there's a mindset of interdependence. We need one another. We're a team, and we're in this together. While your roles are clear, you know that they are mission driven and dependent on one another. And then there's this has to be this awareness of leadership styles. Um, some of this may come out of doing some board self assessment, but I would encourage that the board chair and CEO do their individual leadership assessments if you haven't done any around your own leadership style. When your partner understands what drives you, your preferences, your communication, and personality traits, they are better able to understand how to respond to you and work with you to get the best out of you. Too often we go into these roles blindly without having much of a say in who our partner will be or know much about them. Give yourself the advantage of getting to know someone through a leadership assessment. And then the expectations. This should be done up front in the relationship and updated as necessary in a rolling annual plan. One of the handouts that I have is really questions for each other on both sides of a relationship that you should answer about before you really even get started, or if you're trying to re-energize the relationship. Laying out sort of expectations and what you need from each other is really important. And then succession planning. This is a conversation that needs to happen in the first year of a CEO's or board chair's tenure. It's not about pushing anyone out. It's about having a plan for leadership continuity at the CEO level and the board chair level, whether it's an emergency or a natural end of term or planned transition. When you have a people plan, this discussion can happen naturally. So on both sides, we talked about a little bit, actually, when I talked to organizations about recruiting, the recruiting process is really the beginning of the succession planning process. Getting people to chair committees is a way of succession planning. Getting the right people on committees is a way of succession planning. And it should be started the moment that the new person enters the office, talking about who's coming up next and what kind of experiences do they need to have to be prepared to step into this role. And for those who are CEOs, many of you may have ideas, I'm staying here forever, I'm staying here another 20 years, and that's true. But what happens to an organization when you don't have people around you that can step up and lead? It's so driven on one person. You need to begin to build people and bring people in who you can groom to become the next generation of leaders in your organization. That is the only way an organization can survive and thrive in this environment. And then for the board to be really focused on, board chair, CEO to be focused on results. Too often the board chair and CEO focus on pushing activities without a clear direction of delivering results for the organization. Next time you have something on your agenda, ask, to what end can the board drive results? To what end can the staff drive these results? That's always a conversation that is valued at the board chair CEO relationship. So some of the high performing elements in this relationship, things that you see when they're more in a high performance mode, are diversity and inclusion. If you want diversity and inclusion in your organization, whether it's on your board or within your staff, these leaders must drive this goal or else it will fail. They need to own it and create the culture that will include all stakeholder voices and allow everyone to thrive and be involved in the organization and supporting the mission. Generative thinking. I'm not going to define this for you, but it's important. I can do a whole workshop. Actually, can do a whole day's workshop on generative thinking. But it's one layer above strategic thinking. Thinking about the critical questions that the organization really needs to be addressing about their reason for being. CEOs need to be bringing these generative questions to the board. Board chairs need to push CEOs to constantly ask some of these questions of their staff. But it's not enough to have this kind of thinking if you want your relationship at an optimal or even a high performing level. This partnership needs to spend part of their time thinking about what the board pays attention to, how to frame the problems for the board, deciding what a problem means for the board. What is the purpose that the board should focus on? And really asking the question when you're presented with the problem, what's really going on here? And I'll give you an example. An organization I'm working with has been focused on cuts in government grants to their sector and organization. Some of the board has been focused on ways to lobby key lawmakers to make sure that their grant monies will be funded on the next budget cycle. But the board chair and CEO have stopped that discussion and had the board focus on discussing the sustainable models and strategic partnerships for their programs that don't require them to rely on government grants. They have been working to frame the problem for the board and not let them go down an empty rabbit hole of chasing government money. So it's not that government grants aren't government grants for many organizations still are viable, but in terms of investing the time and the energy, it's probably not a good return on investment. What is a good return on investment is thinking of alternative ways to generate revenue, whether it's earned revenue, whether it's in individual giving or partnerships and collaborations that will allow you to deliver on your mission with maximizing the impact with the least amount of resources. So many times it's the board chair and the CEO who have to decide to frame that conversation. So other things that the board chair and CEO really control is really this culture of inquiry, whether there can be a healthy debate at the board level, allowing people, creating an environment such that the board can really have those difficult conversations, creating safe spaces and encouraging dissent. Also a culture of learning, creating an environment such that the board can learn about the organization's operations, the external landscape, and what good governance looks like and what it takes to be a good board member, given sort of what the priorities are. And then really keeping the board focused on impact, thinking about how to be the most impactful with scarce resources. And ultimately what happens, if you're doing all these things, the board members will begin to feel empowered to lead, and empowered to be engaged in ways that they can give their most from an individual perspective and collectively. So this is another way of thinking about all the elements of a high performance board CEO relationship. I use this graphic a lot because it's also what I show is these are the elements that make a high performing board. So if the board and the CEO are focused on all of these elements, then it's very likely that their board is focused on all of these elements. So I want you to take this framework, and what this is a framework to really think about how high-performing teams are infused into good governance, and what areas does your board need to work on? Is it the essential, trust, roles and responsibilities, and all that's underneath that, the optimal, or the high-performing elements? Now, I will caution you, this is not a linear thing where once you've gotten all the essential things done, you move on to optimal and you move on to high-performing. I do have a client who has a lot of the elements of high-performing, the diversity and inclusion, the generative thinking, maybe even impact, but they're missing some elements under the essential, the trust, the effective communication. And so I would encourage you to think about this as, well, the essential is a building block, and it's hard to build the others without it. But you may find that once you've gotten those things done, that you can jump over to some of the other things under high performing and back to optimal. So I think it really depends on the culture of your organization and what emerges first. So if you're having challenges with this relationship, I would encourage you to just do a reboot. So those who have a little bit of dysfunction, or maybe a lot of dysfunction, just own the problem. Really, the board chair and CEO really need to sit down and focus on the essentials, those that trust, communications, roles and responsibilities, and then figure out how you're going to create connections in that relationship. And then try to chart a new path. You know, get off of the path that you're on that has created some of this dysfunction, and try to really refresh it, re-energize it. Maybe it's a new strategic plan that can help. Maybe it's a new fundraising campaign that can help. Maybe it's just recognizing that there's one or two things that you agree on that you can move forward on. So really focusing on the trust, the roles and responsibilities, and the communication. If you've got those elements down in terms of your relationship, then all of the other things will come a little bit easier. So another poll for you to think about your board chair CEO relationship. Is it operating at a high performing level? Does it have essential elements and a few optimal and or high performing elements? Does it only have essential elements only? Or maybe you don't even have the basic essential elements? Or are you in transition and this is an opportunity to forge a new path? Take some time to fill out the poll, please. Okay. So it looks like still a fair amount of you are in transition, so that's great. But many of you have essential elements and a few optimal and or high performing elements. So I would pick up and reinforce what's strong in your relationship and pick out one or two elements that you want to work on for this year, because realistically, that's about all you can manage. I mean, that's great that there are some of you who are operating at a high performing level. I would just focus on one thing that you really want to take to its optimal level. So let's keep going. So in terms of an action plan for managing this relationship, I think the two need to sit down and sort of define, what does success look like on both sides? Not only in the relationship, but for the board chair, what does success look like for their term? What do they want to achieve in terms of board chair? And similarly for the CEO, what does success look like for the CEO for the term of that board chair's reign? And then together, sort of creating this shared vision about what success looks like. And then finding ways to check in regularly on how are we doing, key milestones, maybe setting some up annually for things that they want to achieve, reasonable goals, given your strategic priorities, where you're trying to go in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And this is really an iterative process, because a board chair can't really define what success looks like until he or she knows what the CEO wants to achieve. Because the board should be responsive to the organization. And then what should be our focus? Recognizing that you can't do it all. And there's also this issue about sequencing. What should come first? If ultimately we want to do a capital campaign by year 2 of the board chair's term, then what are the things that we need? What's some of the ground foundation that we need to lead in year 1 in terms of recruiting, training, orientation, building the board, getting them to think about and preparing them? I would argue it probably is going to take longer to do a capital campaign if they're not ready in that first year. But really, the sequencing of things is the conversation you should have, and being aligned in that. And then thinking about, how do each of us add value to this action plan? What is it that the board chair can do that's unique in their role to move things forward? Similarly, the CEO. How do we relate, and how do we work together as partners to make it happen? And then, given what's going on and where we want to go, how should we communicate? Now, I don't advocate communicating any less than every other week. I do think that if you communicate more than once a week, it's probably a little bit too much, unless there is a crisis going on or in the lead up to a fundraising event and or a capital campaign. Potentially, those are the big things that I think that would drive interaction more frequently than that. But really beginning to define and lay out a structure for you to communicate regularly by phone, but there should be certain communications that happen in person. Maybe a standing breakfast on a regular basis where you get to communicate in person and really begin to develop that relationship. So in your action plan, I would encourage you to do some leadership assessments, whether it's DISC, Hogan, Strength Finders. There's a number of assessments around communication styles and culture. I think that's helpful, knowing who you are dealing with on the opposite side of the table. It really is helpful. For those who have access to corporate leadership and development training materials in your own organization, maybe that's what you bring to the partnership. There are strengths finders, doesn't cost a lot. There are some other assessments online that are free and low cost that can be done. There are consultants. I usually do leadership assessments as part of my coaching. I'm a certified coach, bringing in that to the relationship, and that can happen. I would encourage you every year for the board chair and the CEO to have their own mini retreat, to dedicate at least no less than 2 hours, but probably 3 to 4 hours, talking about what the year is going to look like, building the first agenda together, whether it's your first time being together or it's the first meeting of your fiscal year, talking about what works for each other. Beginning to understand also what's happening on their end of managing the relationship. Really sharing a little bit about walking in their shoes. The board chair sharing the challenges of managing the board. The CEO sharing the challenges of managing the staff. Walk in their shoes a little bit. Now, this is potentially where there can be micromanagement and stepping on each other's toes. But I think when you can paint the picture of what's going on either side, then you're better prepared to come together to focus on what's most important, staying in your lane, and working together on the issues that are really important. And then really begin to accept that that there may be evolving roles given where the organization is going, what the strategic priorities may be, and just how your own leadership style may evolve over time. And these are constant conversations. If you're growing at a fast rate, that evolution is going to happen much faster. If you're managing a crisis, that evolution is probably going to happen really fast. If you're in a more mature organization, maybe the evolution is very gradual and you won't even notice it during the board chair's term. I really encourage you, part of this action planning is really getting to know each other personally. Plan at least one time a year social outing as a team, a partnership. Maybe include your spouses or partners, family members, so that it's just getting to know each other and what each is dealing with and where they're coming from. So I'd like to recap, and then we'll go to Q&A. I think we're on time for Q&A. This relationship has got to be mission-driven. When it's mission-driven and focused on a partnership to support the organization, then it's powerful. Take a fresh mindset that this relationship and the board is a way to empower the CEO's leadership capabilities, to extend it beyond sort of what they are able to do individually. That collaborating, the partnership between the board chair and CEO is really the most effective way to power the board. That there are also all these elements that are critical. There's the essential elements of trust, responsibility, and communication, and character that are really important. There's some of the optimal ones in terms of shared responsibility, leadership awareness, and then the high performing elements that you get into generative thinking, diversity and inclusion, being empowered as a board member. And I think if you start to break those elements down and look at your board chair CEO relationship in terms of that, then you'll begin to figure out what you should be working on in the next year. Recognize that this is a journey. It's a journey. It's a process that takes time, resources, managing change. It cannot be solved in a 1-hour webinar. Hopefully, I'll be able to answer some of your questions. I hope all of you have some questions that we can answer and get things going.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions here so far. First is, what suggestions do you have for balancing the time to build a relationship with other priorities the executive director may have? And they added, this is in terms of honoring the workload an executive director has and not adding more to their plate.
So I can think of nothing that's more important than your relationship with your board chair. If that's not at the top of your list, it should be. And really, I know that there are grant deadlines, there's people who need to be hired, there's a performance that needs to be put on, but somehow this has got to be at the top of your list. And I think most EDs don't spend enough time working on their board, building the relationships. And I actually say when I do a recruiting workshop that most EDs should be spending anywhere from 20 to 30% of their time on building their board. And the big eyes, like I usually do this in the in-person workshops, when you understand all the work that needs to be done to have a strong, thriving board, and understand that the outcomes should make your job easier, then you will allocate the time. I argue that for every hour that you spend on that relationship with the board chair and CEO, it will come back multiple times in making your life easier. So it's about changing that mindset as this is not just another thing to do. This should be at the top of your priorities. Because if you don't have a healthy board chair relationship, everything else you do will be less than effective. It won't be as effective or impactful as it possibly could be. And I will say that again. I'm sort of emphatic about that in a way. This is really important. I see it over and over and over again. Make time. I think the question is what else on your list of things to do can you delegate to someone else or postpone? Because the one thing you can't delegate to anyone else is that relationship with the board chair. That's why it's a top priority.
All right, we have a few more. These next two are pretty similar, so I'm going to ask them at the same time. How much should the board chair share divisions on the board with the CEO? And to what degree should the board chair share issues discussed in executive session?
Okay, so I'll start with the divisions. Well, I'll just answer that. Divisions on the board. I think it depends on what the divisions of evolve from. If there are divisions because they think maybe the CEO is less than effective, I think that the board chair should keep that to themselves and begin to try to resolve that and have a clear vision from the board about expectations of the CEO and how to evaluate them. If the divisions are revolving around the direction of the organization, then I do think that the board chair should begin to share that with the CEO. And I don't know that the board chair needs to share who is driving one direction versus the other, unless it's very apparent in board meetings. It might be very apparent. But I think beginning to address how do we bring that question of how do we bring the board together should be a joint effort, a partnership. It's like, are there some things that we can do on the staff side and organizationally that would help bring the board together and have them see issues more clearly? Do we need to have greater discussion at the board level, lay out the facts? Is it about data? Now, if it's about personalities, I do think that the CEO can be helpful in that regard in thinking about strategies of managing certain personalities, building relationships, building the kinds of alliances within and among board members that help the board move forward. If it's a particularly difficult personality, I do think that the CEO and the board chair need to be in sync about how to deal with that difficult personality, whether it's kicking that person upstairs to some other advisory role. It's really the board chair's responsibility to have that conversation with a difficult personality. It's not the CEO's responsibility. But I do think that the board chair should solicit ideas from the CEO, because more than likely the CEO has been there longer than the board chair and has dealt with difficult personalities before and may have a better sense of what's underlying the issues at heart. So a lot of it, I hate to say this, depends on what the issue is and the culture, but in most cases, those divisions on the board should be a partnership effort. So the other thing is about executive session. Most boards don't spend enough time going into executive session. I think a lot of why boards don't function well is they don't have enough time to talk about issues around their own governance, their own performance. And to that extent, when there are divisions, that's where it first needs to be aired, is in executive session, and to work it out, so that it really isn't the responsibility of the CEO to figure it out. Obviously, executive sessions are the appropriate way to deal with issues around the CEO, evaluating the CEO. And any conversations and the outcome should be relayed back to the CEO if it's about their performance. And so also there's this issue too, I'm dealing with the client, where the board is concerned about the culture among the staff and the culture that the CEO is creating at the staff level. And they have discussed this in executive session and trying to figure out a way forward. I do think that some high-level conversations should be had with the CEO about how they intend to create a high-performing culture where everyone can thrive and do their best. They should be evaluated on that. It's difficult sometimes without going around directly to the staff. Some people use 360 evaluations. I don't necessarily think that they're particularly effective in terms of performance reviews. They are effective in terms of determining what the leadership development plan should be for a CEO. So be careful in that area, because this is where so many organizations get tripped up in undermining the CEO. So not everything you say in executive session needs to be shared with the CEO. I do think that in the executive session, there should be some agreement about what's said and what's not said to the CEO, and reaching consensus on that, and not just dribbling and drabbling. That's a wrong word, but just giving the CEO the information piecemeal. It should be with the context of the conversation. So, and the board should be in agreement about what should be shared with the CEO. Each situation is so unique that I would say also, again, it depends. Any other questions? I think we're at the end.
We are out of time. There are a few more questions, but perhaps we can follow up afterward with those.
Sure.
All right, so we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you everyone for joining us at ArtsFund for our webinar, Optimizing the Board Chair CEO Relationship, with Rena Henderson Mason from Bold Agenda. And thanks so much to Rena for her great presentation. As I said at the top, this program is part of our annual convening series sponsored by the Boeing Company. And before you go, I want to remind you that you will be receiving a survey and follow up to this webinar, and we ask that you please fill it out to help us set the course for future programs. Please also contact me if you would like to receive information about the webinar recording or any other questions at andrew@artsfund.org. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.